Okay, so welcome to part 2 of our video on historiography. We left off with talking about topics. You need to limit the topics to stay within the frame of 20th century. There's so many things to look at and to study, so we really, with 15 weeks, we may need to limit some of those topics that we look at. Primary and secondary sources need to be consulted. So when you're writing and you're crafting an essay, you need to have the sources that you're using, both primary and secondary, and I want to see those listed. When you write your essay, I want a bibliography, and I'll go over what I'm expecting for that, and I have a handout for you. Your conclusions when you craft a narrative of the story of American history from 1900 to the present, your conclusions must be based on the weight of evidence. So you can't say, I feel like this or I think this, if you don't have evidence to back that up. That's what I'm looking for. Of course, variations and interpretations are understood and accepted. And so as we look at Zinn and Johnson, we'll see that they have different interpretations of the end of World War II and the use of nuclear weapons. And so they come to different conclusions based on the same evidence. Their interpretations are different. And so even though you use the same evidence, you may come to different conclusions. And so keep that in mind. Now, your types of sources, I'll briefly review because I'm sure you've learned this in the past at some point. Primary sources are the sources that are produced at the time of an event. And so they're directly connected to the event, and some examples are photographs, memos, dispatches, cartoons, newspaper articles, artworks, literary works, and the list can go on. And so those sources were kind of witness to the event itself. And so those are what we call primary sources. Secondary sources, they're produced after the fact, and they can be produced very close to the time of the event or further on, hundreds of years later. We can still be talking about these historical events. So secondary sources are always looking back with the benefit of hindsight. So they offer analysis and kind of restate the primary source material, but with its own understanding of what's happening in the present. So secondary sources differ from primary sources in that they're not those immediate firsthand accounts of the events. And examples include textbooks, books about art or literature, history books, movies, documentaries, things of that nature. So you'll be working with both primary and secondary sources this semester. Here are a few examples of sources. A soccer player interviewed right after the big game. What would you say that would be, a primary or a secondary source? What about a newspaper article from an eyewitness to the game? Primary or secondary? Or a magazine article quoting the player discussing the impact of the big game on their overall season. So there's different levels, ways of looking at sources. So you want to really closely think about what's a primary source, what's a secondary source. And now for circle back to the idea of questions. And I want you to keep these questions in mind, and these are in your syllabus right at the front. I keep them there so that you can refer back to these often. What is the story of American history? What is the story of American history? You'll be interpreting primary and secondary sources. You'll be looking at your own evidence so that you can craft your own story of American history. And also think about, how do historians construct and evaluate the stories they tell? How do Zinn and Johnson use those primary and secondary sources to construct the stories they are telling? And what stories are they telling? And then the last question, why study history? Why do we do this? And of course, there's a really big question right now in particular, with lots of information online. Like I said, we've got almost an overabundance of information, which really makes us wonder what we can trust. Can we trust history? Can we trust the people that say that they know what the story is? Keep in mind, there's no one agreed version of history, so how can we trust it? As new research continues to cast light on old facts and new historians ask unexplored questions, can we ever know the whole truth about what happened? What is the truth? How do we know it? Can history ever be objective, or can it ever be accurate? These are some big questions I want you to contemplate. If we can't depend on our history, can we ever fully understand where we are going, and can age-old disputes that rely on particular versions of history ever be resolved? And whose benefit do particular versions of history work for? So think about the ways that American history has been interpreted, the stories that have been told, who benefits from it, who doesn't, lots of political ties to certain versions of history. So these are all some big questions I want you to think about. Now, I've briefly touched on why I use Zinn and Johnson, and I'll talk a little bit more about it here. You probably have gotten your history from school textbooks, but how balanced do you think those textbooks have been? Do you think school textbooks give you a one-sided view of history? Are they interpreting all of the facts? Are they doing it in a biased way? And when does historical fact become historical fiction? For example, we may examine two different accounts of the California gold rush of 1848. If you get one account from an academic historian and the other account from a tour guide, you get different accounts. Is one of them a lie and one the truth? Which narrative is more reliable? Or perhaps we need both. We need both of those points of view to get the full picture. And so that's why I use Paul Johnson and Howard Zinn, because while they're both different in the conclusions that they come to about the history of America, they're both using the same sources. They're both highly respectable historians. They're both doing the work of a historian. And I think it's important to just look at the very titles of the book to think about what do these tell us. So if we look at Paul Johnson, A History of the American People, and then if we look at Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. So right off the bat, you get two kind of very different ideas about what these books are about. A History of the American People, or A People's History. So what is the difference in that? That's kind of your assignment for this week, to think about what you see as the differences in those titles. Now, Howard Zinn is an American historian. You may have heard of him. He was born in 1922. He did serve in World War II, as did, as did Paul Johnson. He, however, is an English historian, and he was born in 1928. So they're relatively of the same age, and Johnson also served in World War II, so they've had similar experiences. They're both historians. Now here's a review of Zinn's People's History, rather scathing review. So keep in mind also that these books aren't always that popular with the public. There's been some critiques and some issues that these historians have raised that the public has not always been that receptive to. Soon after its publication in 1980, Prominent historians expressed upset over Zinn's people's history, and they called it the quote-unquote topsy-turvy quality of his narrative. And so his narrative dispensed with a traditional view of enlightened Europeans civilizing the Americas and led readers to believe instead that, quote, it was a downhill all the way, unquote, after the, quote, destructive white strangers arrived, unquote. And another historian, author Oscar Hanlon, said that the people's history was a, quote, deranged fairy tale, unquote. So you can see that his take, Zinn's narrative, was not necessarily the most popular. But also, neither was Johnson's. To some historians, he was not accurate. He proudly, quote, proudly asserts that he makes no effort to conceal his opinions. What this means is that his approach to history is polemical, one-sided, and prone to gross oversimplifications. And so while this historian who's reviewing Johnson's book, his name is Eric Foner, while Eric Foner writes that Johnson is an excellent storyteller, and he, describes George Washington, Ronald Reagan, very well, he makes it very clear that there's certain people in American history that he does not like and turns them into somewhat of a caricature. So Foner believes that Johnson's account was not fair-minded. And so there's another historian's critique of how Johnson crafted his narrative. So you can see that historians are, for the most part, we can be a very contentious bunch. We like to argue, we like to critique each other's narratives. But there's a reason for that, because the sources that we're using are open to interpretation. There's different ways of looking at it. And so Zinn is not lying, Johnson is not lying, but there's different stories. And this gets really to the crux of what history is and how we do history. Can history, in fact, be valuable? And I really want to know what your take on that is and what you see as you read through the materials for the semester. One last thing. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in 1903 that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And that is something that I will carry through this semester. I will keep circling back to this point, that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And so this will be a long-running theme for this semester. So I just want to introduce it to you here, the end of this lecture, so that you keep it in mind as we go through. And Du Bois, if you don't know, he was an influential African-American rights activist in the early 20th century. He co-founded the NAACP and wrote Souls of Black Folk. He was also the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard, and he's a very important activist, and we'll be looking more closely at him. And he gave this speech, the closing address at the first Pan-African Conference, and those lines that I showed you here, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. He spoke those lines in that address. And here's the program that you see, July 1900. So that really just opens up our conversation for this semester. We'll start U.S. history from 1900 to the present time. And so that's it for this week's lecture. I do want to bring attention to the syllabus. We'll open it up here. You'll be looking at the film Do the Right Thing. I'm not asking you for the whole thing, but from 1:25 to 1:45, roughly 10 minutes for this assignment, you'll watch that clip and post your own interpretation of what happened. So you're doing history, you're recording, you're an eyewitness to an event, and you're recording it on the discussion forum, and I have instructions there in the forum when you click on the link. So I'm going to wrap it up. This video is going to close. I'll be locked out in about 20 seconds. So I will talk to you soon. If you have any questions, please email me, contact me. I'm always here. Thank you.